Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of The Western Spirit. Today we have someone very special, someone who Haviv, I know you through your wife. So if your wife is such a great person, you are. So that's B'shivcho shel Adam. I also say today we have with us Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv is first of all, for a long time, a veteran Israeli journalist. He's a senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He's covered, obviously, most of you probably already heard of him and know him from his work covering the conflict in Israel, foreign policy, Israeli society, internal stuff, the Jewish diaspora. And for the past, I think, year, Haviv has been touring and speaking on American lectures all over the English-speaking world, in the US, the UK, Canada, and probably other places that I never heard about. Haviv, it's an honor to speak with you.
Ariel, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And, any friend of hers is by definition my boss. So,
So
it's
I won't
good to
be a
be here.
boss.
Okay.
I want to first ask you about something we've heard this week. We're recording this on election day in the US. So we're not going to really talk about the election because we have no idea what's going to happen. But we did hear a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that Iran gave messages to its, I guess, Arab partners in the region or people in the region that it's going to attack Israel in a stronger and more aggressive way. I don't remember the exact wording. So do you think that they're going to actually do something? Because we heard that when Israel attacked Iran the last time, they destroyed all their anti-air defense systems. So they're much more vulnerable. Why would they want to attack Israel at this point?
We have leaks from conversations in the Iranian high command with Khamenei himself and the heads of the IRGC, where, according to various press reports from pretty respectable outlets, and it's never perfectly easy to know what's happening in the highest levels of the Iranian regime because it's a dictatorship obsessed with controlling the message. Like there was the Churchill's old saw about Stalin and the Soviet Union, where the only way you find out who's winning, it's like what do you call it? It's like pit bulls fighting under a carpet. You find out who's winning based on the bodies that are being thrown out, right? That's how you know who's on top. There's a lot of that sort of smoke and mirrors propaganda. The regime is very careful. For all dictatorships, they have to be very careful controlling their image because fundamentally they exist on frightening people into submission, and so they have to constantly control what comes out. So it's not that I don't trust the reporting out of Iran or reporting about Iran. It's that you have to take it skeptically because it is overwhelmingly propaganda. Even this true stuff is still sifted through and propagandistic in one way or another, serving one group or another. So having said that, we have reports according to which Khamenei said that the Israeli attack was too big. It wasn't too big. It was too embarrassing. 140 Israeli planes flying around Iran at will. And then the Israeli military reporters putting out from the army that 4 of the pilots are women. And the head of the IDF technology directorate, a major general who years ago was an F-16 pilot, just didn't want to miss it. So he joined up and he was one of the pilots, one of the 21 major generals of the IDF. So you reach a point where the way the Israelis experienced it and messaged it was that they were kind of having fun over the skies of Tehran. The idea that Israeli jets would be flying over Tehran was so unthinkable a year ago. And now it's entertaining and obvious. And the collapse of not just Iran's homemade air defense systems, but in fact the collapse of the fancy new Russian stuff that they'd spent quite a bit of money on. All of that put together, according to the reports, Khamenei said we actually have to respond, and dramatically. There is a fear in Iran that Trump will win. They don't know, they don't believe they can negotiate with Trump. They think the Democrats are very careful in ways that they know how to play. And they think that Trump is not careful and that might not be so easy to play. And so they're worried about Trump winning, so they don't want a conflagration that'll make the Democrats look bad on Election Day. Election Day is now. We know it hasn't happened before Election Day, unless it happens in the next few hours, because Americans haven't woken up yet. But there is that sense that now, I'll just to cut to the chase, from my perspective, gosh, I hope so. I hope they attack, and I hope they attack soon. And it'll be fun if they do, because they want me to live for a generation under the terrible fear of them choosing to annihilate me. And I don't want to live in that fear. And they are weak, and they are liars, and they are pathetic, pretending, posturing little peacocks. And all they can do is destroy weak states, weak peoples. They have wreaked horrific genocidal damage in Syria. Millions of Sunnis fled, 80% of the Christian population, which was 10% of the country 13 years ago, have fled or been killed. And so they are a weak part, a weak regime, basically spending its time preying on the weak, and massively tyrannical and oppressive to their own people. And they also want to exterminate me and murder my children. All of that put together, I hope they attack. And I hope they attack dramatically, so that I can attack so dramatically that we really actually make a dent in that house of cards.
So do you think, well, obviously, like I said, we don't know what's going to happen for sure, but do you think that in a way Israel made a mistake that it didn't go after the nuclear sites last time? Because everybody was talking about that that Israel was going to either get the oil or the nuclear sites, and then American pressure supposedly made Israel go only on military targets. Do you think if they're any way thinking of attacking us, maybe we should have gone all in right away?
I worry. Well, so the simple answer is I don't know. I don't know details. It's not my profession. I don't know the costs. I don't know our capabilities in detail in terms of actually taking out these sites that were constructed for over the course of 20 years for the sole purpose of not being easy for us to take them out. Just because I think the regime is incredibly weak doesn't mean I think the country is somehow fundamentally incompetent or incapable of building these things properly. So I don't know. I know the Americans didn't want us to go crazy. I also know that ever since we went crazy, early April, when we took out the first Iranian general, the IRGC general in charge of Syria and Lebanon, and that resulted in that first Iranian missile attack. And then Shukr and Nasrallah and everything we've done to Hezbollah, and everything that we have shown, which is that if you actually tell us that we are now on a path to our own extermination that you have set for us, and if we dare escalate, it'll only speed it up. And so we should just get comfortable on this sort of slow road to our own annihilation. By telling us that, they basically convinced us that we got to do anything we need to change the path, change the course. And so we went crazy. And one of the wonderful things about us going crazy is that the Americans found their own backbone. So you find, for example, while they were trying over the last few weeks to rein in the Israelis and prevent the Israelis from bombing too much in Iran, in the American view, the Americans started cracking down in Iran in ways that demonstrate just how utterly facile and ridiculous the American administration has been. America has such immense power that it doesn't actually have to fight in order to win. And the only thing lacking in American power is awareness of its power. So, for example, over the last month, the Treasury Department has issued sanctions on some of the oil tankers that have been taking Iranian oil, smuggling Iranian oil out of Iran to China. And those sanctions have raised the insurance costs on those tankers and caused the Chinese to stop buying that oil for some period. Well, that tanked the ability of the Revolutionary Guard Corps to take in most of the foreign income that it takes in. That's the kind of stuff America can do cost-free, just accidentally in an afternoon. And it hasn't done it. When has it started to do it? When it's trying to tell the Israelis, don't bomb the oil export depots. We can stop the oil without you bombing them. Well, as we say in Hebrew, Boker Tov Eliyahu, good morning, Elijah, right? Nice of you to join us. over here in the Middle East trying to stop Iran, America, right? America has been at our side in a tremendous way. The Biden administration has been at our side in a tremendous way, but only defensively. Right now, you have CENTCOM ships accompanying, escorting, the few ships brave enough or that have some insurance arrangement that allows them to actually try and pass by Houthi waters and go into the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Suez Canal. And they're only allowed to pop out of the sky to shoot down any missiles headed toward the ships they're escorting. What? How is it possible there's a single piece of Houthi infrastructure left? The U.S. Navy, this vast multi-hundred billion dollar operation, exists almost entirely for the sole purpose of securing international commerce. And one of the most important avenues of international commerce has been shut down by a desert tribe that doesn't know how to build roads. But it knows, because of modern technology, it has these abilities to target ships and destroy infrastructures. And the Americans will only be defensive. And there are a couple exceptions, the B-2 bombing, for example, but that came after we bombed Hodeidah. So getting the Americans to wake up, getting the Americans to fulfill functions that have nothing to do with us, that the Americans always believed are their own fundamental functions, getting them to face down Iran with the unbelievable arsenal of tools at their disposal that doesn't require boots on the ground and doesn't require war, has been one of the great tasks. Apropos elections, I don't know who to vote for. I have universal health care. Israelis live 5 years longer than Americans on average. I truly, there's so much at stake in these elections for all different kinds of Americans. They're fighting their culture wars. I don't have a right to wade into it. Whoever wins, I wish they would wake up. And I wish they would be serious, understand American power. The first step in power is understanding your power. And then it'll be a whole different region.
Haviv, I want to ask you something that I was thinking about as you were talking, which is you mentioned that Iran didn't think that Israel would have the stomach, that we didn't think we even had the stomach to fly 150 planes or whatever it was over Tehran. And it's like now we're laughing about it and making, it's a fun thing. And so do you think retrospectively, if Iran looks back from October 7th to today, do you think they look back and say to themselves, this was a big mistake that we let Hamas do what it did and start this whole thing? We lost basically our proxy in Gaza. We're losing or extremely diminishing our proxy in Lebanon. In Syria, Israel's just attacking whoever it wants pretty much with impunity over there. The Iraqi militias seem to be a lot less scary than they were in the beginning. Where we lost basically our entire prestige that we thought we had. Or maybe they're happy about it, that they're able to, the Israeli economy is struggling. Israel seems to be less and less, in the diplomatic world, less and less loved, like we ever were, but less than we ever were. So how do you think they look at it?
We know that in the immediate aftermath of October 7, they felt that it was very frustrating that Hamas pulled the trigger. The problem was timing, not the act itself. And this was something that we discussed in Israeli politics and your newspaper, my newspaper. We talked about these things, where Sinwar looked to us very foolish because he pulled off October 7, but in fact Hezbollah had been planning an October 7 5 times larger with vastly larger capabilities, and he kind of ruined the surprise. And so one of the army did two things. One, it had this immense call up into Gaza, went to war in Gaza to fundamentally reorder Gaza and pull Hamas out at any cost and by any means necessary. And that has been absolutely devastating to Gaza. But the second thing the army did was push a whole bunch of troops up north. There have been tens of thousands of infantry and armor and all kinds of other troops in the north constantly over the course of the year. And then when the government made the decision that we can now move significant resources to the north and push back Hezbollah, you saw what happened in the last 6 weeks. In other words, devastation for Hezbollah. So Sinwar ruined the surprise, allowed the Israelis to wake up, and destroyed for Iran First of all, Hamas, which isn't quite a proxy, it's a Sunni organization. But on the question of Israel, they're perfect allies, and so Hamas is embedded in the proxy system in that way. But it doesn't take orders from Iran; it works collaboratively. Hezbollah is just literally a branch of Iran. I mean, it's a piece of the IRGC in every way except the technical. And yeah, that cost them a lot. I always thought Sinwar was an idiot for doing that. Was foolish. And then I owe him an apology. So there's the headline of the episode. I owe Sinwar an apology. Because when we went after Hezbollah was the first time I learned. I knew we had penetrated. I knew we had immense capabilities. I knew we had great spies in Tehran. Look how we killed Hania. Look how we've been killing people there for years and pushing back their nuclear program and smuggling bombs into the secret sites. But I had no idea how much Hezbollah was penetrated. Sinwar is a man who has been obsessed for decades with compartmentalization. He's absolutely convinced there's an Israeli spy behind every corner. He trusts nobody in Hamas except his own brother and maybe two or three others. And he's always been obsessed with compartmentalization. And so he didn't share with Hezbollah because he thought there was some chance that if he shared the timing with Hezbollah, Israel would know ahead of time and the whole thing would be ruined. And I thought that was unbelievable folly because he ended up having an October 7 that destroyed Gaza without actually hurting Israel strategically. It hurt Israel terribly, but not strategically. And then the last, 6 weeks happened, and then I've come to conclude that actually Sinwar was right strategically, not to share that with Hezbollah. So I think that Iran is now coming to grips with the sheer raw fact, the scale of Israeli competence, Israeli power, Israeli willingness to fight. We were not supposed to be so willing to fight. One of the central theories of us that drive our enemies is that we are something foreign, artificial, and therefore fundamentally fragile. They often talk about how they love death and we love life. And that's something that Jews, literally, Hania said it, Nasrallah said it, and Jews often say, see, they admit it, they love death, we love life because we're better, right? But what they actually mean is we have faith and we're willing to die because we believe in God. Actually, these Jews, you never know with their, half-fake religion. And that discourse about us as something profoundly fragile drives their thinking, and everything they're doing is ultimately, the ultimate vision is a kind of restoration of a more powerful Islam that they dream about and have this deep ideology of nostalgia about early Islam and its conquests. And Islam has grown weaker, they argue, because they've grown less convinced of their own, piety, less pious people of less faith. So if they reclaim the faith, they are invincible and we are fragile. That, in other words, they underestimated us and overestimated themselves. And they did it for reasons of deep, big, fundamental identity and sense of self and theory of history. And so they're kind of stuck in it. And it turns out that Hezbollah was much less than they thought it was. We are much more than they thought we were. And Iran now has a huge problem. I think they would definitely have not had October 7th. That was true at the very beginning, but I think now it's true even more so. They actually begin to understand that there's something fundamentally and profoundly weak in themselves. Are they going to draw the correct political, theological, and strategic conclusions from it? No, of course not. They're a bunch of tyrants. They're just going to try and survive. But yes, I think they would absolutely, desperately like to turn back the clock on the last year.
So I want to ask you about particular. So we're in Gaza. We're since October 7th, a lot more than a year already, and Israel is still doing operations in now Jabalia, the whole northern Gaza. We know the Americans. If I'm not mistaken, yesterday I just read Blinken spoke with Gallant about that. The Americans say there's still not enough supplies, humanitarian aid going into northern Gaza. There's this letter by the Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary threatening that America will cut off all aid. I think that's basically the gist of the letter if Israel doesn't dramatically, I guess, put in more humanitarian aid into northern Gaza. Where are we now in Gaza? What is the actual aim? And also, do you think that this is Israel is denying it, but there's all this general's plan, Tochnit Ktsinim, whatever it's called, where basically the plan is to basically move out all the people from northern Gaza to sort of take land away from Hamas. Is that actually what's happening, or are we reading in too much into it?
That's a lot. Those are a lot of questions. Let me try and take it one at a time. The fundamental strategy in Gaza, I think, has been a good one, with a lot of exceptions and complaints. Complaints that have to do with, delays forced on us by the Americans. If you delay going into Rafah for 3-4 months, every single Palestinian family living in a tent suffers 3-4 months for no reason. Excuse me. Every single hostage held in some dungeon suffers for 3-4 months or dies for no reason. And everything, right? So delays of this war are genuinely cruel. So I would say this: there's so much to tackle there, but there's fundamental strategy, there's the humanitarian question, and then there's what's actually Israel's plan in the north, and what are we looking at? The fundamental strategy has been good. There aren't a whole lot of strategies available to us. The enemy built the battlefield. The enemy literally built Gaza, Gaza's cities, Gaza's civilian population, the entirety of what is Gaza. Hamas spent 17 years building it into a particular kind of battlefield for a war in which Hamas planned for Gaza to be destroyed. And that doesn't exonerate us. If you think that we're doing it badly, we're still doing it badly. It doesn't, right? But if you think Hamas is good and not responsible for what Gaza currently looks like, then you haven't been listening to Hamas, which planned for this to be what Gaza now looks like. There was a very silly academics who were sort of politicking their academics, and they're morally horrified, and they think that their own moral emotions are the only thing that matters in the world. And so they talk about us in really ridiculous, silly ways that don't help anybody. But there are also much smarter, more serious academics who have looked at this war and made an argument that I think the Israelis should listen to, which is, for example, you can listen and then say, well, I understand it, and it's not, but that's an argument that's actually a real argument, which is the argument that Hamas wants you to come in and destroy Gaza. Don't give it what it wants. Now that, when academics told us that, for example, the head of the Institute of War at the Pisa School at Columbia wrote an op-ed like that, in which she argued Hamas is planning this destruction of Gaza, and that's its major leverage, strategic leverage on you, and don't give it the destruction of Gaza that it's asking for. The understanding of how much Hamas wanted this to be the outcome is in my own test for a serious person. So if someone comes at me clutching with pearls and screaming about the pain that Gazans have gone through, some of what they talk about is totally fake and a lie and just never true and hasn't been true. So enough, far more than enough is absolutely real for it to be massive and something that we have to think about constantly, and we don't talk about it enough in Israel in Hebrew. But, and it's a big but it matters. Hamas left us very few other strategies. And any strategy that leaves Hamas in power is a disastrous strategy that guarantees more war. And there aren't a whole lot of suggestions that anyone has been able to offer us for getting Hamas out of power. And this is more or less the path, is you clear an area of civilians, you hunt down Hamas into the tunnels, and you have to destroy what's in the way to get to the tunnels, to get to Hamas. Hamas comes back above ground. The Americans had this terrible experience in Afghanistan with a strategy called clear and hold, where they would clear the Taliban out of a valley between the big, mountains and mountain ranges of Afghanistan, and then they would hold the valley to prevent the Taliban from coming back in. That turned out to be a disaster because they ended up just creating 10,000 targets scattered all over Afghanistan. And so it was actually a really bad idea. And it gave the Taliban a lot of places to hit. The Israelis learned in part from that, but from many other experiences, and actually developed a theory that you take an area and then you pull out of the area. And that gives you two advantages. One, you don't have massive numbers of targets on the ground for the guerrillas. Two, when they reclaim the area you left, you have new targets above ground, right? How do we pull them out? By clearing an area and letting them take that area and then moving in. And you start to see this, what we've been calling for many months now. And I first heard this from a general trying to describe the situation, the second entry doctrine. The second entry doctrine is the idea that the first time you enter an area, you're entering a battlefield built by the enemy to hurt you, to make it hard for you. So there's snipers and traps and booby trap buildings and IEDs and all kinds of other things. The second time you enter the area, you've already smashed all of that. The enemy has been destroyed. You pulled out. They came back. They haven't had time to rebuild the battlefield. And you saw that. The first battle of Shifa Hospital was a month standoff with snipers and IEDs and buildings that fell on the soldiers. And the second battle was 3 hours. And 200 Hamas guys were killed and 500 taken prisoner by the Israeli army. And the Israelis pulled out, were in areas nearby, but not actually in that compound. And when the order came, within 20 minutes, the Israeli forces were engaged. From the giving of the order to the actual firefights was 20 minutes. And so to transform all of Gaza into a second battle, or third or fourth, but second battle in terms of character, is how you degrade Hamas efficiently over time. It's not going to be fast. It's not going to be a month. It's not going to be 6 months. We might be talking about a year. We might be talking about more, until you've degraded Hamas enough to replace in Gaza any kind of Hamas rule. At this moment, there's nobody to hand aid distribution to without Hamas getting in the way. There's nobody to, do anything without Hamas still able to come. You have to degrade them enough for that to all be efficient. That's the strategy question. It is a good strategy. It is a smart strategy. And Gaza is suffering terribly because of the strategy and Hamas's strategy, which imposed on us very few other options. This is the best of the strategies available to us, I think. I have not heard a convincing argument that isn't pearl clutching that there's a better strategy available to us. And by the way, I'm not. That's not a polemic. I'm serious. I would love to hear a better strategy. I would love to hear that in the international discourse. It's just not happening. Nobody's actually raising it. And the other two questions were the humanitarian question and the general's plan. The humanitarian question is, look, there is no chance that we can't do better. There's zero chance that we can't do better on the humanitarian question. And therefore, I am not only open to the suggestion that we're failing, I'm very open to that suggestion and angry at that suggestion, because you're not allowed to be failing that in a situation like this. Morally, it matters more than any other imaginable moment. It matters now. Also, strategically, tactically, it really matters. It really matters. And if you can't distribute aid without Hamas taking the aid, you invest more military resources in making sure the Israelis are distributing the aid. And if that means that our soldiers are more vulnerable, you figure out the tactical ways to prevent it. I was in the Israeli infantry. I was in, what's it called? Chomat Magen, defensive shield back in 2002. I have done miluim in the West Bank a dozen times over the years, also elsewhere, but in the West Bank specifically. I know that tactics adapt to meet the dangers that the enemy produces. The enemy, there's an arms race, obviously, a tactical arms race of improving each other's tactics to overcome the enemy's problems. You find the tactical solutions and you get that humanitarian aid out. We have a lot of friends around the world who desperately want us to win. Surprising number in the Arab world. They're quiet because we look evil, and we look evil for no reason. Our ministers talking the way they talked, the soldiers producing unbelievably idiotic movies. And I'm not talking about the videos where there's potentially actually some kind of a crime. 300,000 soldiers are called up to Gaza and to the war. there's just statistically no chance that there aren't criminals among them. Statistically, there's no chance that in the tens of thousands of airstrikes, that not one is a crime or is a mistake that reaches the point of recklessness or beyond recklessness. And so I'm I wish we could have a real discussion of that, and not the kind of discussion that's out there, which is an attempt to paint us as a people that doesn't deserve to exist. There is a debate in the world trying that the anti-Israel campaign is trying to start over whether or not we deserve to exist. That's a stupid campaign. The whole idea that you can delegitimize a country is a stupid idea. And it's born in Arab supremacist ideologies and in the horror of the dishonor to Islam that our existence represents. It's not born in love for Palestinians. Nobody on this earth is going to convince me that the Ayatollahs in Iran want to destroy Israel because they care about Palestinian rights. They don't even care about Iranian rights. And so, because of that, it kind of sucks all the air out of the room when you come to talk about actual humanitarian questions, where I think Israel, when I say it can do better, I mean is failing, and we should talk about it, and there should be that demand, and there isn't, and that's very frustrating. And this is a conversation I'm used to having in Hebrew. I don't usually talk in English about these failures because because there's this campaign out there, but also the emotions of foreigners doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually fix it. I need Israelis to be focused on this. But there we go. Translate a little bit from the Hebrew. We could do so much better in the humanitarian question. We must do so morally. And it's such an obvious thing for the strategy that I really can't comprehend why we make it so difficult for our allies.
Sorry for interrupting. Does that basically also answer the whole thing with the general's plan? Meaning, I interviewed, we're going to publish this weekend. We did a talk with John Spencer from West Point. He's the guy who Netanyahu likes to quote about the ratio and everything. Very interesting conversation. And I asked him about the general's plan, and he said, I support Israel, but that's not legal under humanitarian law. I really, really hope he said that they're not doing it. And I don't think they're doing it. So, does that also what you just said answer what my next question was?
Yeah, I just want to note, I do agree with John Spencer's argument. When I talk about humanitarian, I mean aid. I do think that we try to miss the civilians, and the data points are, there are millions of data points, and by Hamas's own numbers, that's true. And Hamas's own numbers are an exaggeration to our detriment of the reality on the ground. And none of that takes away from the massive suffering of these people. I imagine in my head, when I think of Gaza, I don't think of Hamas. Hamas have to die. I'm extremely comfortable with that. I was a soldier. I'd be comfortable taking part in it. I'm feeling a little bit left out and old and creaky because I wasn't called up. I aged out of reserves few years ago. But when I imagine Gaza, I imagine the families trekking between tent encampments to avoid airstrikes. That's not anyway, I don't want to take away from that, but also this is the war we have to fight. We don't have another. It's possible to think those two things, and people who can't think those two things are deciding that war is illegal because Israel's conducting it, not for any other reason. We are not worse in Gaza than America was in Mosul. We're better.
Or Fallujah.
And other places. And nobody cared in Mosul. And nobody cares now in Sudan. Nobody cares. And they care here. You want to tell me that's because they actually care about war and suffering and death, or because there's this campaign that's fundamentally founded in supremacism and in anti-Semitism. And so the Palestinian suffering is absolutely real, and the campaign to save them around the world is fundamentally an eliminationist, evil anti-Semitic campaign that doesn't actually care about them. If Assad was doing to them 10 times worse than we were doing to them, this campaign would not exist. Yeah. And so anyway, all of those things are true. I agree with him that we are trying to miss. But we could do so much more with aid, so much more with food, so much more with solutions. I personally can figure out things that we can do. We have, and I'm not one of the serious professional, officers who actually know how to handle these distributions and build out these bureaucracies. And so it's shameful. It's shameful that we're not doing it. I suspect it has more to do with bandwidth. I suspect it has more to do with just incompetence than it does with evil. But because it's so detrimental to the war effort, but I don't actually know. And anyway, that criticism I accept and share. I'll just to the general's plan. We've been tracking the Israeli actions in the villages right up against the border in South Lebanon. And it appears that what Israel is doing there is clearing a kind of no man's land, in which I don't know what the rules will be in this no man's land, but I suspect they might be that anything that enters gets shot. In other words, there'll be a fence, there'll be signs, and it'll be basically a minefield. Like on the Golan Heights, like in, between North and South Korea, there'll just be this no man's land that nobody can go into, and that will push the future Hezbollah cells past anti-tank missile range. In other words, they'll still be able to bombard and fire, and but they won't be able to shoot a missile into an open window. They'll need to use more expensive drones, right? Things like that. It's to make things harder for the enemy and to give that extra layer of protection to ensure that Israeli civilians can go back to the border. Because that appears to be part of the plan in Lebanon, a temporary no man's land until things stabilize, until Lebanon itself asserts sovereignty over its south, until there's safety there. People suspect that the general's plan is being implemented in Gaza. As John Spencer said, if that's true, that's a big problem because it's moving people out, claiming territory in this context. And it would appear to be a violation of Israeli laws of war, never mind international or others. So I don't know. No man's land that is a buffer from the Israeli fence is a legitimate temporary measure until Gaza is stabilized and has some serious sovereign entity that can control it and build it and de-radicalize it and rebuild. If it's more than that, it's a huge problem, and it doesn't help Israel on the international stage, especially, and this is my point, with its friends and allies that large parts of the government are holding conferences about building settlements there, something that the vast majority of the Israeli public doesn't want. And that, anyway, so that's where I am. I accept some of the criticism. I don't accept the legitimacy of the fundamental campaign against us. And the basic strategy is right. And on all the things that are causing quite a bit of human suffering, we could and must do much better.
Two more subjects I wanted to pick your brain. The first one is, after October, you've been speaking, obviously, and when we mentioned to you in the beginning, you just came back from the U.S. I saw on your Twitter, you met with Richie Torres, who we also had on our show. So I guess when October 7th happened, we saw the next day, my dad lives in New York, Times Square, big anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protests. And from there, it went on and on and on. I think irregardless of what Israel did, they still protested against Israel. So even if Israel wouldn't even respond after October 7th, they were anyway going to use October 7th to protest and hate Israel and all that. And I guess one thing that I thought of was, when I grew up in America, we knew that there was crazy right-wingers on the extreme right who were neo-Nazis, anti-Semites. That was obvious, and no one really took them seriously, pretty much. And, you knew that they were out there. I never thought of, until maybe the last 2-3 years, that this extreme progressive leftist, really anti-Israel, but I think anti-Semitic sort of thing, it was so prevalent. And then we just saw it happen on campuses, on the streets, all over the place. So much so that even the president of the United States at the DNC says that the protesters have a point. I think because he felt that that is a sort of constituency of his. How do you look at this?
So many people can speak to this so brilliantly and subtly. I think of it in really simple, sort of broad sweeping terms, because it's a culture war. It's part of the American culture war. It's not really about us. We are cartoon characters in their minds, a vocabulary they use to talk about their own ideological frenzy and debates and internal wars. The basic structure of the idea is that we sometimes means Israelis and sometimes Jews, and often Jews, and literally in the room with these people in a classroom at Columbia literally simply means Jews, and they say Jews, are on the wrong side of the question of privilege and power. And these are very sort of shallow but mobilizing ideas borrowed from some versions of Marxism that talk about these invisible structures of power in society and how privilege works. And it's an attempt to place that onto the American racial experience, where there's been a huge amount of absolutely real structures of power and oppression over many, many generations that sustain themselves. But the problem with placing these Marxist interpretations on them is that it gives the veneer of making it all scientific. And also, it argues that it's unfixable, except by demolition.
Yes.
Except by creating a counter oppression to counter the existing oppression, except by all kinds of awful, evil stuff. So it means that people have to, if there's racism toward minorities, then there has to now be racism toward majorities. That's the only way out. And it's the kind of stuff where there is it allows the resurgence of old ideas of anti-Semitism, but covered over with this unbelievable new self-righteousness. Because the Jews are part of the system of oppression, the Jews now have to be singled out. Their maliciousness has to be shown. We have to talk about it. We have to discuss it. The constant refrain of never stop talking about Palestine. Well, it's never, never stop talking about Hamas's oppression, never stop talking about, the Iranian regime destroying, you can kill 500,000 people, or 600,000-700,000 people, as Assad did. Nobody thought that was something we should never stop talking about. But Palestine, we should never stop talking about because it's a cultural project. I was at a club in New York over the course of this trip, and the club has on the window a Jewish star. It's owned by Jews, established by Jews, and part of the stained glass is a Jewish star. And the club owner told me that people now constantly say, in a way that people never used to notice, that like you'd have an Italian flag in an Italian restaurant, so you had a little Jewish star at this comedy club. But now people are like either complaining about it because it's inappropriate, or they're triggered by it, or they say to him, well done, good job, good for you keeping it in the window, right? There's a campaign, and it is a concerted campaign rooted in these hierarchies of privilege, which have to do with also identifying people's innate identities they can't escape from. It's fundamentally sort of essentialist. Yeah. There's a campaign to lower the social standing of Jews, lower the social standing of the oppressors, and the Jews are oppressors, and that is placed atop a discourse coming in from the Muslim world, which is, of course, definitely true because it's from the global South. So to this same discourse, whatever the Muslim world feels is absolutely the true feeling about everything, which is essentially supremacist and enraged that the Jews pushed Islam back, and therefore they must be annihilated. And that's the fundamental ideological vision of Islamic restorationism of the Iranian regime. So the annihilationism of the Jews, accompanied by, the Arab Middle East contains no Jews and can contain no Jews. Jews can't move back. And that's still not doesn't register in this Western, version of this, which is this sort of post-Marxist, or I don't know, kind of pseudo-Marxist hierarchies of power and privilege kind of discourse. These two things are laid on top of each other, and they create a totally righteous validation for eliminationist bigotry.
Yeah.
And the Jews in America see it. They smell it. Not all of them can quite explain it, and all of them were forced to read, Gramsci or Franz Fanon or these thinkers that are now being assigned to college students. And they read 2 paragraphs and then the Wikipedia article, and then, move on with their lives and go protest. But they smell it. And it's not so much dangerous as vile. It's anti-Semitism is a special thing. It's not another bigotry. It is a bigotry, and it begins in Christianity, and then it gets its new wind in Islam, because both of these monotheistic religions are founded on the foundations of Jewish ideas, and they have to explain why Judaism is wrong and they are right, even though it's clear, and it's part of their own story of their founding myth, that they come from Judaism in one way or another. And so they have to explain why Judaism is still wrong, and they turn on Judaism because they're supposed to supersede Judaism. And they talk about how the Jews refusing to accept Christianity or refusing to accept Islam means that Jews are standing in the way of the redemption of the world. Mm-hmm. And you saw that going forward. Hitler thought the Jews were preventing the arrival of a better world, and communists thought the Jews were the capitalist oligarchy that's holding down the working classes. It was an idea. Anti-Semitism is the idea that the Jews are preventing the redemption of the world. It was invented once, and then it was used again and again and again in different ideological formats. When you go to Columbia University and you talk to them about privilege and power and Palestine, you discover that the Jews are once again, whether they're in Israel or in America, preventing the redemption of the world, all except the 3 Jews sitting here next to me who are in the encampment and understand the Jews are evil and therefore they're good, which is, by the way, exactly what the Soviet communists did with their Jews. So it's fundamentally anti-Semitic. And if you find among them a great many who are driven to a protest because they saw on TikTok pictures of horrific imagery of people suffering catastrophically in a war, those people are absolutely legitimate. And the core idea is anti-Semitic. But it's an anti-Semitic core that is now mobilizing to lay the groundwork for the destruction of Israel using this war, but all of it driven ultimately by an intellectual engine that is just the oldest version of anti-Semitism.
Finally, let's talk about Jews. It never starts that way, in a good way, but let's talk about Jews. One of the things that today we mentioned, we're recording this on election day in the US, so we don't know the results yet, but that is not the actual topic. What I do wanted to say is that when you saw on the polls in Israel who they preferred, Trump or Biden, Jews in Israel support Trump like in a large percent more than you would think, maybe. And Jews in America are Democrats, and even in the most generous of polls to Trump, he still is losing the Jewish vote. And so, obviously a little bit different with Orthodox Jews in America, but still most Jews in America aren't Orthodox. And so how do you think this is just, I think, a reflection of the difference between us Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora? As someone who maybe lives sort of both worlds, because you live here and then you go meet Jews there, how do you see this rift? Do you think that it will be a problem in the next, more than it is, or how do you look at it?
Well, I think Israeli support for Trump, and it's enormous. It's like 65 to 15 or something like that. Different polls have, will add or subtract 5 points, but the gap is so enormous that, by the way, Biden did much better.
Yeah.
But there's a perception among Israelis, driven mostly by just sort of run-of-the-mill news cycle, that Harris has a lot of sops to the very progressive edge that hates Israel, but it's very shallow. It really is provincial. It's just about, he was good to us when he was president. The Democrats, who the heck knows? Biden was good to us in war, but then won't let us fight, and she'll be worse. It's that I literally just laid out, the entire depth of it. In other words, there's no more that the Israeli public is really debating this. It's not talking about it, and there's nothing.
Haviv, let me just put in one comment about that. That in the actual elections in Israel, the Jews in Israel will vote more to the right than the Jews in America. Meaning American Jews living in Israel, but American Jews living in Israel are a tiny group. No, I'm saying Israeli Jews in Israel vote in general the right for the past 20, 30 years, the right-wing coalition.
But not substantively. That you can't map the Israeli left-right onto the American left-right.
Right.
The Israeli left collapsed with the Second Intifada because its basic fundamental process and idea and civic religion was the Oslo peace process, and it collapsed in 140 suicide bombings. Mm-hmm. Netanyahu is to the left of Bernie Sanders on healthcare. I mean that, by the way, literally. I mean, just a total universal healthcare. Nobody questions it. Netanyahu is a big fan of legal, rare abortions. It's just, you can't map that Israeli left-right divide because the fundamental issues are different. The things that Americans are divided on, Israelis solved decades ago, and the things Israelis are divided on, Americans could barely imagine. So these are not, we can't really understand why the other one struggles with the things they struggle with. We're two very different societies. But I would say that the Israeli preference for Trump is very, very simplistic. And it's basically, what's Israel's interest? And taken, whatever we can see from that. And in that sense, American Jews just have so much more at stake, right? They have the foreign policy, but they also have every domestic policy, questions of federalism, what the federal government could do, what their state government could do, what the abortions and Supreme Court and 1,000 different things, all of which are very anxiety inducing. And I understand why. A lot of, these are also not just elections at the federal level, they're elections at state and Congress and all of that all at once. So American Jews have much more at stake. American Jews have a long liberal tradition because liberal America is an America that they believed for many, many generations was more welcoming to them. They integrated profoundly, saw them as Americans. The right used to look suspiciously anti-immigrant, and in many periods it was. That's changing with the rise of this illiberal. It's not that it no longer exists. The Democrats are still mostly more comfortable for Jews to be in, and more this and that. But they're starting to see this illiberal campaign on the Democratic left, and so it's driving some reconsideration of that. But the majority of American Jews will vote Democrat. The majority of Israelis would prefer, an Iran policy of Trump to an Iran policy of Harris. That's a divide that makes perfect sense. It really makes perfect sense. I do think,
Haviv, just to maybe push back, is that if you look at culturally speaking, Israeli Jews are more conservative in the way they live and the way they think, I think, than a lot of American non-Orthodox Jews. So meaning they'll have, on average, Israeli Jews will have much larger families. On average, all Israelis, even if they're most of them, like overwhelmingly, if they're not like really anti-religious, will fast on Yom Kippur and will do things that in today's American Jewish world are a lot less common than they maybe used to be, and maybe also synagogue attendance and stuff like that. And also the default is to go to an Orthodox shul. So even if you're like someone who doesn't go to shul, to synagogue, except for on Yom Kippur, on the Yom Kippur, you'll go to the Orthodox synagogue next to your house. And even the people who are against, let's say, church and state, synagogue and state, will say, Beseder, but the real Judaism are the rabbi with the hats and the jackets. I have a lot of friends like that. They'll be very anti religion, but then they'll say, "Oh, the real Jews are those."
The synagogue I won't step foot in has to be an Orthodox synagogue.
Exactly.
Yeah, Professor Shlomo Avineri used to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that sense, but maybe you're wrong. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's all sort of utilitarian. So they're looking out for what's good for them. And
look, 6 months ago, Biden beat Trump in those polls.
Yeah,
by 20 points, because he was defending us. There came a point where Israelis concluded that the Americans are only defensive, and they'll back us defensively, but right into a wall. At some point, we have to take the offensive, and then they're always against us. They're addicted to the status quo. And then a lot of this tension began between the governments, but also in public opinion polls. And so I don't know if it has to do with some kind of deep cultural gap like that. Israelis tend to be a little more conservative, not a little more, they're much more Middle Eastern. Half of Israeli Jews come from the Arab world. All of Israeli Arabs come from the Arab world. They have a lot more conservative sense of family and conservative sense of, we probably have the most conservative gay rights campaign in the world, right? Who's the most prominent gay activist in Israel? The Speaker of the Knesset, who's a conservative right-wing minister. He's also married to a man and has 2 kids. He has a very conservative life.
Israel to get married. That's the
that's
thing.
Fine. Yeah, but I'm just saying, like there's a tendency to conservatism to the point where the gay rights campaign's demand is led us into the conservatism, right? That's the demand of the Israeli gay rights campaign, which is radically different from the sort of gender theory campaign over in the United States. So we tend to be more conservative, but Democrats were beating Republicans in public opinion polls in Israel 6 months ago. I think it's not one of those deep things. It's a response to events, to the news cycle, to how Israelis perceive it. Look, President Harris will have to, if she wins, will enter office with a lot of distrust from the Israeli public. And not just distrust over the constituencies she feels, closer to, like, will she take that, very deep progressive line, but just distrust on her ability and willingness and competence. And I think willingness is the most important part, to face down Iran in the Middle East. With sanctions, with serious sanctions they don't evade every other day because America doesn't actually care. Actually seriously face down Iran. I think Israelis think Trump is more likely to do that, and that's what those polls are. Anyway.
Haviv Rettig Gur, it was first of all a pleasure to talk to you and very enlightening. I just want to say, I think this was like my first podcast about Israel related that I don't think we mentioned Netanyahu once, which in a way is very, very good. Because usually when you mention him, you start talking about things that aren't substantive in Israeli talk today. So in that sense, I'm very happy that we didn't do it. So
thank you for mentioning Netanyahu. I just have to say that
exactly.
Look, he's a very important topic, but there's so many important topics, right? So yeah.
So thank you so much for being with us. It was really, really, really fun and interesting, and I think that we spoke about important things. And hopefully, we'll have you back on someday.
Appreciate it. I'd love to.
Thank you, Haviv.